Dear participants of our online lectures project by Young Scientists Council of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, today we have lecture of extremely interesting guest, Mr. Ronald Osborn, professor of ethics and philosophy of La Sierra University at the United States, with the topic defining genocide. Is the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention adequate? So give the floor to our guest, please, Mr. Osborn.
Thank you so much. Well, it's an honor and a delight to be with you this morning. I'm very happy to share some thoughts with you, and I'm also excited and delighted to be reconnecting with a friend of mine, Mariana, who was sitting in on a class of mine about 2 years ago where we were talking about genocide. And so some of the material I'll be talking about today will be directly from that course. Before I say anything more, I just want to say that, as a U.S. citizen speaking to people in Ukraine, I know that there's been a lot of trauma and difficulty in your country recently and ongoing with the invasion by Russia. I feel very honestly ashamed of many of the actions of my own government in our failure to show more solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And I think many American citizens feel the same way and wish that there was more our government was doing. But at least as an individual citizen of the United States, I can show some solidarity with you by just talking with you and being in conversation with you. So it's an honor to be just sharing this time with you across a huge distance, but technology has allowed us to shrink the gap. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint now with you. By the way, as I talk, if there's at any point, if you have a question or a comment or something you want to interject, feel free to jump in. I want to keep this a little bit like a conversation, not just a lecture. But what I'll do is I'll try to share with you some key thoughts here. Let's see if I can actually how. All right, can you see this screen right now currently?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, great. So yeah, what you're seeing here is the title to my presentation this morning, which is really about how do we define genocide, which this word has been in the news a lot lately, especially with the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and as well as Ukraine. It's a word that is being used a lot in the news. But there's also, I think, a lot of confusion about the meaning of the word and how the word is defined in international law. So what I'll do today is just try to share with you a little bit of an overview of the legal definition, and then we can talk about this question. Is the legal definition adequate? Is it enough? Or should we modify our understanding of the word in some way? Now, this word genocide was coined by this man, Raphael Lemkin, who was a Jewish man who had fled from Poland, I believe, to the United States during World War II, during the Nazi Holocaust, and he felt that existing international law needed a new concept to name what was happening. He felt like the existing categories of war crimes and the Geneva Conventions, he felt like they didn't adequately answer or define what was actually happening. And so he began to try to think of a word, and he he came up with this word genocide. And here is what he said the word, for him, it meant when he first presented this term in 1944, in a book in 1944. He defined it like this. He said, by genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. He said it was a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Now, when Lemkin talked about this, we can notice a few things. First of all, he says that this is a crime that is directed at nations or ethnic groups. Those were the two categories he named. He said it was a coordinated plan. In other words, it was a crime of intent. And it included a variety of different actions aimed at destroying what he called the essential foundations. Now, what were these essential foundations? It's interesting when you read Lemkin's book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. He began going down a kind of list of what he considered to be the essential foundations, and killing or physical destruction of people was not the first thing on his list. In fact, it was not even the second or third thing. He listed the essential foundations of life to include political foundations, social foundations, cultural, economic, and biological foundations. And it was only quite late in his list that he included physical foundations of life. So killing of people would be attacking the physical foundations of life. But in his view, genocide could include a intentional campaign to destroy a nation or an ethnic group by attacking all of these other kinds of things as well. For example, he talked about how in Poland, when the Nazis invaded, they flooded the Jewish communities with alcohol, cheap alcohol, and pornography. And in his view, this was an example of actually a genocidal policy because it was aimed at destroying their religious and moral life. So in other words, Lemkin's view was pretty expansive, and he thought of genocide as including what we might today call cultural genocide. And we can return to that concept later. However, in the 1948 Genocide Convention, after the war, when this word was picked up by the United Nations and became really part of international law, the definition or the concept of genocide was more narrowly defined. And here is how the Genocide Convention defines genocide. So first of all, genocide in international law has two parts. The first part is referred to as mens rea in Latin, which means guilty mind. In other words, there has to be a genocidal intention, a genocidal purpose. And then there is the actus reus, which means guilty act. So genocide is both a crime of intent and also it's about the deeds. You could have the actions, but if there is not genocidal intent, the mens rea, then genocide is not occurring under this definition. And this is really why it's oftentimes very hard to prosecute a case of genocide, because the perpetrators of genocides rarely leave clear and detailed evidence of the guilty mind, of their genocidal intentions. They oftentimes would conceal their intentions in different ways. Even within the Nazi Party, it was only a small number of people in very secret meetings who would very openly and directly talk about their genocidal intentions. But for public consumption, it was seldom directly mentioned, or it might only be hinted at or alluded to. All right, so those are the two parts of genocide. Now, the first paragraph of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention defines genocide as, quote, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And we can break down this definition piece by piece. So first of all, any of the following acts, and I'll show you the acts in a moment. There were a variety of different actions that could be considered genocidal, and it does not only include killing people or things that we might normally think of. So any of these, the acts, which will be enumerated shortly, committed with the intent to destroy. Now, this is important in two ways. First of all, the intent. There has to be a genocidal intent. But notice the next word that is used. The word is to destroy. And destruction of a people group can occur by killing, but it can also occur in other ways. In other words, destruction and killing are not the same thing. So that's also something we have to think about. Notice the next part. To destroy in whole or in part. Many people build or imagine that the desires an intention to destroy an entire people group. But actually, the law, international law, the UN Genocide Convention, makes clear that genocide can be committed even if it's only a part of a population that is targeted by a perpetrator. And then we come to the next part of the definition, which is broader than what Lemkin originally talked about. You remember he talked about national and ethnic identity, but the UN Genocide Convention expands this to also include racial or religious groups. So these are the protected categories under international law: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. Now, you might already be wondering, well, what about groups that don't fall under one of these categories? For example, what about political identity? One of the most famous genocides in history is the Cambodian genocide, but some scholars actually don't call it genocide. They refer to it as politicide, because or auto-genocide, like self-genocide. And the reason is because in the case of Cambodia, the people who were being targeted were people considered members of, well, they were considered to be political ideology was the reason they were being destroyed. Like, they were considered class enemies. So they weren't being targeted for national reasons or ethnic reasons or racial or religious reasons. So technically speaking, the Genocide Convention does not apply to the Cambodian genocide, you might say, because the people who were killed were not members of any of these categories. The final two words here, I think, are also incredibly important. So, it's acts committed with the intention of destroying, in whole or in part, these different groups as such. Now, what is the significance of those two little words, as such? If you think about it, if you look at all of the rest of the definition, you could make the argument that, for example, when the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the United States dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II, you could argue that it fulfilled almost all of the language of this definition. This was an act committed with intent to destroy, in part, national members of a national group. In other words, Japanese people. So why would the dropping of the atomic bombs, which I think it's easy to argue that this was a war crime because it was indiscriminate targeting of civilians. There was no, in fact, it was intentional to destroy a large civilian population to demonstrate the power of the bomb. You could make the argument easily, I think, that that was a war crime. But was it a genocidal crime? And this is where those last two words, as such, are really significant. So the question becomes, did the United States drop the bombs because it wanted to kill Japanese people simply because they were Japanese people? In other words, killing them for being Japanese as such. And this is really kind of the distinction between genocide and other kinds of war crimes. If the perpetrator of the act is trying to kill people who are part of a group of one of these groups only because they're part of that group and for really no other reason, that's when you're dealing with a crime of genocide. And I think you can really see this clearly in the case of the Holocaust during World War II, where near the end of the war, the Germans were actually losing the war. They were suffering defeats on the Eastern Front. And even while they were losing the battle, they continued to divert resources, manpower, and equipment and other war resources to accelerating the killing of Jews. In other words, it was viewed by the Nazis as being like a goal that was even worth pursuing at the expense of the other war efforts. And so that I think very clearly and graphically illustrates this. All right, so what are the acts in the law that are defined as genocidal acts? So killing members of the groups. This is very obvious, right? So this would be blatant. But here's another one: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. This is also a genocidal act if you're causing mental harm to people for the sake of destroying them for being members of a specific ethnic, racial, religious, or national group. That can also be considered genocide under the law. Third, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Again, remember, genocide doesn't have to mean trying to kill everyone. It can mean just killing some portion of a group. Fourth, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. So forced sterilization, for example, would be a genocidal crime. And finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. If this forcible transfer of children is done with the intent of destroying members of a group simply because they are members of the group, that would also constitute a crime of genocide. Now, the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide was modified slightly in 1998 in what was called the Rome Statute. And the most important things I think to note about it are the following. So, first of all, conspiracy to commit genocide was dropped as a punishable crime. In the original law, you didn't have to even commit genocide to be guilty of genocide. Even if you just planned genocide or conspired genocide, you could be punished for genocide. And in 1998, that was removed. Article 6A specified that to establish genocide, it had to be shown that the actions took place in the context of a manifest pattern of similar conduct. So it couldn't, in other words, you have to look for more than just a single action. It needed to be part of a larger pattern of conduct. And then it also defined children as being persons under the age of 18. Now, maybe I should pause for a moment. Are there any questions based on what I've said so far? There's probably a lot to already talk about. Okay, no comments. No comments. Okay, so I think I can keep. I'll continue then. Okay. Oh, wait a second. I've got to refine my PowerPoint. Okay. All right. Back to the PowerPoint then. So let's talk about some other concepts. And I already have shared one of these things with you. I've spoken about it briefly. I talked about the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. So let's talk about a few other ideas that are related to, these ideas oftentimes get confused or conflated. Because they can overlap. But let's distinguish between a few different terms. So first of all, crimes against humanity. In international law, crimes committed as part of a widespread attack directed against any civilian population, including murder, extermination, enslavement, torture, rape, or any other form of sexual violence or sexual slavery, these are crimes against humanity. And this is another concept in international law. And in the case of crimes against humanity, you don't necessarily have to show well, genocide is clearly a crime against humanity, but not all crimes against humanity are genocide, because not all crimes against humanity are specifically targeting groups for being national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups, All right, so that would be one definition or term that's also significant. War crimes. What are war crimes? These are basically violations of international humanitarian law, and especially the requirement that combatants not target civilians. In concepts of just war theory, there is some allowance for targeting legitimate military targets, even if you know that civilians will die, if the target is not the civilians, but the target is actually a military thing, and civilians are also harmed by the attack. There is some allowance for that, but you cannot specifically target civilians. You have to try to distinguish between civilians and non-civilians. And if you don't, this is clearly a war crime under international law. But it's not necessarily genocidal. Again, all genocide is a war crime, or all genocide committed during war is a war crime. All genocide is a crime against humanity, but not all war crimes are genocide. Not, you understand, okay? And then finally, we come to another term that is maybe closer, you might say, to the concept of genocide. It's the concept of ethnic cleansing. Now, this is not recognized as an independent crime under international law, but it's widely understood to mean the following: rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of certain groups from the area. So how would these two concepts, what is the relationship between them? Again, there's some area of overlap. Ethnic cleansing might be genocidal, and genocide might include ethnic cleansing, but at least conceptually or analytically, these two concepts can be distinguished from each other. For example, can you still see the screen?
No, we can see your screen now.
Okay, good. Okay. Let me give you a historical example where ethnic cleansing and genocide maybe don't really perfectly overlap. So, for example, in the case of India, during the partition of India from Pakistan, when Pakistan and India separated and became two different nations, there was a huge amount of transfer of populations where Muslim people in India were forced to leave, and they left and moved to Pakistan, and Hindu people in Pakistan were huge numbers, were forced to leave, and they moved to India, and there was this transfer of populations in both ways. We could call that a kind of ethnic cleansing in those areas, but I think generally speaking, scholars don't describe that or refer to that as genocide. However, oftentimes these two concepts they they tend to overlap. So there's a scholar named Norman Naimark, and he writes about the Soviet deportation of the Chechen Ingush people in 1944. And basically, he says, in practice, ethnic cleansing bleeds into genocide. The practical results are the same regardless of the intent of the perpetrators. The Soviet removal of the Chechen Ingush people from their homeland in the Caucasus Mountains in February 1944 is an example of what we might call genocidal ethnic cleansing, because Stalin didn't really have a genocidal intent. Like he didn't feel like he wasn't trying to simply destroy the Chechen Ingush people. However, he was indifferent to their fate, and he wanted them out of the mountains for his own purposes, so he simply forcibly removed them. And the consequence of this was that their way of life and their identity as a people was effectively destroyed, and they could not continue to retain their identity because of their forced displacement and the way they were scattered. It really resulted in the destruction of their entire way of life and their identity as a people. And so the consequence of this ethnic cleansing turned out to be genocidal. Let me pause right here. Let me stop this share and just open up for some conversation. I would be interested to hear your thoughts. Mariana, I see your comment there. The same thing happened to Crimean Tatars back in the day. Okay, I don't know that history. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, obviously we can see, I know all of this probably is very close to home for you because of the atrocities that Russia is currently committing in Ukraine. We can clearly see war crimes. We can clearly see crimes against humanity. And possibly we can see genocide also. I know that that Ukrainian children have been kidnapped and taken by Russia. If this is being done with the intent to destroy Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian ethnicity, then this would be a crime of genocide. The hard thing is in international law, if you were going to try to prosecute a case, would be you would have to show that this was being done with genocidal intent, and this is just a very difficult thing to prove in a court of law because like I said earlier, the perpetrators rarely leave behind a clear paper trail that shows what their intentions are. And so it has to be inferred from their actions what their intentions are. Okay, let me be quiet and open up for some conversation. I would be interested to hear from you.
I have some question for you. So, at your opinion, we have all proofs openly define the Russian aggression and the Russian doings in the territory of Ukraine as genocide, especially with cases of rocket attack, shelling of civilians' infrastructure, execution, and so.
Yeah, so the question I think for international law would be, I don't think it is easy to show, I think, that these are war crimes, unquestionably war crimes, indiscriminate targeting of civilians, war crime, mass violence directed at civilians, crimes against humanity, right? If there's an attempt to forcibly remove Ukrainian people from certain regions, that seems to me to be ethnic cleansing also. The question about genocide becomes because in almost every single war, there are war crimes. In fact, I even think we can say every war. Every war, there's war crimes, you know. Many conflicts, there are crimes against humanity, and in many conflicts, civilians are targeted, you know. And like I said, the United States in World War II targeted civilians. The United States, for example, firebombed Tokyo, the city of Tokyo, even before the atomic bombs, mass targeting of civilians, and also in Germany, in the city of Dresden and some of these other cities, right? So the question becomes really, what is the difference between this kind of behavior or action in war and genocide? Because Raphael Lemkin wanted a new concept that would be different, because he felt like the existing law had language and ways of talking about those kinds of actions. There was a way to talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity. Although I think crimes against humanity was also a phrase that came into existence really around World War II as well. But he felt like there was something unique and different about what the Nazis were doing. And so he wanted a new word, a new concept to name what he felt was a specific kind of violation of human rights. And so again, this concept of as such, it has to be that the goal is not, like in the case of the Allies, they were bombing the Japanese civilian populations and the German civilian populations. But it was not because they simply wanted to kill Japanese people and German people for its own sake. They were doing this because they wanted to destroy the morale of the Japanese and the German people, to force them to come to the negotiating table for the sake of winning the war. You understand the distinction here, the difference? In other words, there was a kind of utilitarian logic to it. It wasn't that they just wanted to kill Japanese people. It was that they felt that by doing this, they could achieve their other goals. And genocide is a case where killing the people is its own goal. It has no other purpose, really. It becomes the goal itself. The goal is to kill the people simply for being members of these protected groups. Does that help to clarify the difference?
Thank you for your answer. And I have a second question. What's the relationship between concepts of genocide and ethnocide in some aspects? Because we can often hear that genocide of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire was in some aspects ethnocide, firstly.
Well, ethnicity is one of the protected categories under genocide. So genocide includes ethnocide. Ethnocide would be a form of genocide. However, not all genocide can be targeting people for reasons other than just ethnicity too, right? So for example, religion might not be about ethnicity. Religion might be about beliefs. And so if you target people for their religion, that would, I think, not be ethnocide as such, or doesn't have to be. Yeah.
Thanks. And have any questions for our participants?
I see a hand.
Mr. Vasilovsky, please, your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, dear lecturer. Yes, for your very interesting speech and presentation. Yes. And I have a question from my international law major and my professional career, yes, on international law. I would like to interest to you about, as we know, since the adoption of 1948 Genocide Convention, the understanding of genocide has significantly evolved, particularly as modern conflicts increasingly involve not only physical destruction, but also systematic efforts to erase identity, language, collective memory. And we know that no practice now from International Criminal Court and other criminal institution and other political institution, any position on this question. In this context, Russia's deportation and forced re-education of Ukrainian children seems to reflect a form of destruction aimed at the cultural and national continuity of the protected group, especially Ukrainian national group. Given this shift, how should international law in future, or maybe now, treat cultural genocide today? Maybe should it be recognized as a distinct legal category, new legal category, or maybe interpret as a key indicator of genocidal intent within the existing convention framework, or maybe we should avoid this because expanding the concept may weaken the convention precision and enforceability. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. Actually, why don't I share with you a few more slides, because I think it speaks to your question, really. And you're a lawyer, so you're actually probably more well informed about these nuances than
excuse me, maybe I miss.
No, I think you probably know this material very well, and I really appreciate the question. Let me share this this slide, and maybe this can help. So, yeah, to your point, and this is really the question of the subtitle of my presentation: is the UN Genocide Convention adequate? And there are many scholars who argue that we need an alternate approach. For example, Helen Fine, she argues for what she calls a more sociological definition. She thinks, in other words, we need to expand the range of protected classes because, the UN legal definition, it only includes race, ethnicity, nationality, and religion. She thinks that we should expand this to include all nonviolent, persisting units of society. So this could include gender or sex. It could include class. It could include political identity. This would expand the range, because if you think about it, imagine the Cambodian genocide. It actually is technically not a genocide under the UN Convention, but most people still think of it as a genocide. Or you can think about in Indonesia in the 1970s, I believe, when there was an attempt to kill all communists, and this, it was a huge number of people who were killed. So this is one critique of the law. It doesn't extend. It should be extended. It doesn't include enough cases. I'm sorry, the name of the author was dropped here for this one. Let me see. This one here is basically let me see if I can find the author's name. This is David Nersessian, and he's arguing for the concept of what he calls cultural genocide. In other words, we need to define destruction much more broadly. Because, like you were pointing out, what about efforts to really destroy the identity of a group that could be very long-term? It could be much more structural, policies that suppress the language of people, policies that are aimed to change people's identity from who they are to something else. In China, for example, the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in China is really designed to destroy their identity as Uyghur Muslim people and incorporate them into the Han Chinese, body politic. And that also seems to be a kind of genocide. And so David Nersessian basically is arguing that we need to talk about cultural genocide, which the UN Genocide Convention doesn't seem to really adequately address. And then we have another concept, which is the concept of colonial genocide. And this would remove the mens rea, the intent requirement in some sense. Colonization, sometimes there's a mens rea of genocide, but sometimes what we're talking about is long-term conditions imposed by imperialists on conquered people that results in the indigenous people of a land being eliminated over time, or ceasing to exist, or not being able to survive. So this concept would also go beyond the existing law. Finally, I want to include this quote from David Sheffer, because David Sheffer, he argues that perhaps the word or the concept of genocide, he's not saying it's an unimportant concept, but the problem is that oftentimes we end up getting bogged down in debates about the definition, trying to define it and trying to then figure out whether a specific case fits the legal definition or not. And he thinks that this can actually have a paralyzing effect. It can prevent us from acting. It can prevent people from moving forward because they feel that, well, if we can't define it, we can't do anything. And he thinks that we should move beyond semantic debates. Whether or not a genocide has occurred, we need to name war crimes and atrocities and crimes against humanity for what they are. And we need to mobilize states to act to prevent these kinds of atrocities and to hold people accountable for these atrocities. And the question about genocide is something you might say that the historians can debate or figure out later, or even lawyers can figure this out later. But when atrocities are occurring, you don't need the word genocide to take action. And unfortunately, sometimes we have the impression that the word genocide is more important than anything else, or it's like the worst imaginable crime or human rights violation. But if somebody is the victim of violence, they aren't worried so much about what you call it. What they're worried about is they want it to stop, right? And so basically the argument here by Sheffer is that we need to act to stop violence and atrocities and crimes against humanity, and we don't need to prove genocide or genocidal intent to know when something is wrong, and when it's when the right thing to do is to act to stop it. Does this make sense? I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. Veselovsky, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, Bogdan.
Okay.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on this?
Please repeat about it.
Do you think that the UN definition should be revised?
About my question, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the Commission on International Law under the United Nations maybe can develop and can work on recognition as a distinct legal category, yes, and propose to amend the Genocide Convention if we say about Genocide Convention. If we say about practice of international criminal courts, this is there will be amendments to Rome Statute, and this is a difficult procedure to amend this Rome Statute. Yes, as we know that some countries, maybe most of countries, cannot agree on this amendment now, and maybe in future. But if we would like to restore the faith in international law in future, yes, international law must be and remain alive. Yes, because I support the idea and notion is a life law as a law, and not only national law but also international law as a life concept, life category, which constantly is developed by international community.
Yeah, thank you for that. And your comment connects with Mariana's question here in the chat box. She asks, coming back to history, could you please remind us why the Genocide Convention excluded political groups and which countries opposed that decision? So, part of the process of getting this UN Convention on Genocide passed, it was a political process, and the Soviet Union was opposed to including political identity as a category for obvious reasons, because Stalin was in the process of destroying and eliminating his political enemies, and so it's an imperfect document, not only because the planner is like, it's not simply like they failed to think about these things. It's also because the process of getting laws like this passed is political, and so I think everyone recognized it was imperfect. Lemkin recognized it was imperfect, but was it a step in the right direction? And I think it was, but it is an imperfect document, and and maybe we need to move, maybe we need to expand it, or maybe we need to move beyond it. But at least it gives us a way of naming certain kinds of actions, with a kind of moral force and clarity that people did not have before about certain kinds of crimes against humanity. Mariana, does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And just one more thought on my side regarding the last quote, like the last concept that, the genocide concept should be that we should not concentrate on the but rather on stopping the violence. And I guess for many, for many countries, for many leaders, the word itself, genocide, is so terrifying, is something which is very often equated to Holocaust.
Yeah.
And therefore, in some cases, there might be this, reluctance even to realize that some crimes or some atrocities are genocide per se. So I think, the last thing you mentioned on boarding is also very, very important for us, especially today when, Ukrainians are experiencing everything they're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think, this is something that in the area of genocide studies, there's a field called comparative genocide, and one of the debates that they have in the field is really, should genocide studies be centered on the Holocaust as this kind of unique defining event that really is, you might say, the heart of what we're talking about and gives us the clarity or the lens we need? Or should we take a more decentered approach away from the Holocaust to include more cases and expand our understanding of what genocide is, right? And I think that even Raphael Lemkin himself actually took a decentered approach, because he argued that there were many cases of genocide across history. The Holocaust was in some sense unique, but it was not really completely unique. There were many cases, and he also didn't, I think there's a mistake if we assume that genocide means something like Auschwitz. You know, that picture of, when we hear the word genocide, it's almost like our minds immediately go to gas chambers and crematoria. And this kind of the way that the Holocaust of the Jews looms so large in our thinking about genocide has maybe prevented us from recognizing and seeing that genocide actually can be happening in many other ways. And oftentimes it's not so obviously horrific and violence. It can be more subtle processes that unfold over time. It can be other ways of trying to destroy people as such, you know. And so you know, that's also, I think, a significant move that needs to happen. And it's not necessarily a change of the law, but it's a change in the way that we think about what genocide means, so that we can recognize it in less familiar forms when it, you know, when it doesn't necessarily look like the Holocaust, but it can still be happening.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thanks for your comments.
Thanks for your question and answers. Have any question from the audience for our guest? If there are no questions, we are glad and thanks for you, Mr. Ronald, and for your speech and genuine words about genocide and their defining. It was nice to see you in the next issues of the online lectures project.
Thank you so much again for having me. And again, let me just end by saying, you know, that I want to send my love and support for all of you. I know it's a incredibly difficult time in Ukraine, and my heart goes out to everybody who has experienced this war and this suffering. And you know, there's a question from iPhone Frog 55. I assume that's not your name, but can we stop genocide in the future? You know, human nature being what it is, it's hard to be optimistic about genocide ever vanishing or disappearing entirely from the human story. But we can certainly do better, and hopefully the kind of violence that we see in the world today, we will someday look back on and feel that, you know, that we somehow have moved to a better place. I know this is a very dark time in human history, and it's easy to get to be in despair about what we see happening around the world, not only in Ukraine, but in many places, other places also. But I'm just reminded, you know, when I study history, that there have been dark days in the past as well. And people like Raphael Lemkin and others, by fighting and advocating, have helped to move the needle a little bit towards a more humane world. And I think it's up to all of us to just do our part wherever we are, to keep persevering, hopefully, and fighting for that vision that he had, which is that perpetrators of crimes can be held accountable, and we must continue to fight and defend humanity, you know.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Ronald, for your thoughts and views, and we hope that we can stop the genocide in our world, especially for our generation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, please stay safe and be well, everyone. I'm delighted that I could chat with you a little bit, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future, hopefully.
Thank you so much.